afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Clear Pathways Ohio Collaborative Lunch and Learn. These are monthly meetings that are giving us an opportunity to take a closer look at various topics related to the crisis response continuum. I am Tom Craig, your host today, and I am the Director of Mental Health Program at PEGS Foundation. And I'm with the Clear Pathways Initiative. This month, we will explore the progress of 988 crisis call line response, and we will hear from some folks from the Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. We will hear from Doug Jackson, the 988 administrator, Tom Gerber, the 988 technical planning manager, and we will hear from Abby Welschlager from the 988 Quality Improvement Manager. And they will share the successes and the challenges of operation of 988. You will get copies of the slide deck, which we will have information such as some of the usage metrics of 988 in Ohio, and you will learn about the work being done to continue operationalizing 988 in Ohio. And it'll be good to have that information. It'll be stuff that you can look at later. You'll be able to learn about the work being done to continuously improve the operationalizing of 988 in Ohio. And many of you are probably involved in some of that work. They will describe the plans and challenges being addressed as Ohio emerges as a national 988 leader. Just a reminder, jump into the chat if you have questions. There's a little chat button at the very bottom of your screen next to the share screen button on the left of that. And we'll keep an eye on that. Please let me introduce Doug, Tom, and Abby to start the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom Craig. It is great to be with the PEGS Foundation today to be talking about 988 in Ohio. And I know that we have an audience on here, and the audience continues to grow as this presentation is starting, but happy that many of the people who are joining us today are those who have made 988 a success in Ohio. I get the opportunity to talk about how things are going, but without call centers across the state, 988 would not be operational. So we have many staff who are involved out of many call centers. We're going to talk about what that structure looks like today, and I'll be referencing those call centers. But happy that they're joining. It truly is a collaboration in Ohio between our Ohio Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services and the call centers, again, located throughout Ohio. So as we get started, I will be sharing time with my teammates, Tom and Abby, both, as we look at different parts of 988 and what is happening here. So I will introduce them when we get to slides that they will be talking about. But we do hope that the presentation today will just offer you a good insight into where things are now. Now being today in February 2023, we have been operational since the launch in July of 2022, and actually operational even prior to that. As we prepared to launch, we had things in place and calls being answered. So we're going to talk about what that looks like, and just start with that conversation with what did Ohio look like prior to the building and launch of 988? Well, call numbers, call centers are not new in Ohio. They're actually not new across the country. But since 2005, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline, or NSPL, has been serving Ohio through call centers that were in existence in Ohio. Those call centers were answering the NSPL hotline, which was a 1-800 number that could be dialed for anybody, especially focused on suicide prevention, but even more broadly, people in crisis. When 988 became a number, there were several changes that occurred. Number one, the change from the long number that might be hard to remember, the 1-800 number, to just a 3-digit number. Very easy to remember. As we continue to educate people and make it known across the country what 988 is, we believe that that 3-digit number will be easily answered or easily remembered. But What we also know is that people in crisis aren't always in crisis and considering ending their lives. So some people could be in crisis and just need to speak to somebody. So 988 became the suicide prevention and crisis lifeline. So crisis, a very intentional focus of the 3-digit number. So 988 in Ohio, it is connecting Ohioans to a local response. So because we offer coverage across Ohio, Ohioans call the number and most likely are getting a response by somebody answering the phone in Ohio. Just talking a little bit about that. If you look at the map on the left-hand side, the map actually indicates that only about half of Ohioans had access to NSPL, to the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline. As we expanded the coverage and preparing for the launch of 988, we expanded the Lifeline network in Ohio. We went from 12 call centers to 19 call centers, and now have coverage for every Ohioan, no matter where they live in the state. So this map it's very detailed. You'll see the red stars; those indicate where those call centers are located. By color coding, it also indicates what region of the state they are covering. But call centers are just one piece of the ideal crisis continuum. And we always want to keep that in mind. Call centers are the place for a person to connect, which means that if they call, somebody answers. But what happens if that caller needs a response? Well, we have to have a system built in Ohio where there is an ability for someone to respond. Now, in the past, that response could be from police or medical services. We have started to grow in Ohio the local crisis response teams. And so we are happy that that continues to grow, but we are more formalizing what that looks like throughout Ohio by the service terms, the service definitions, the reimbursement rates, and really building that mobile crisis outreach so that the respond can be fully available to all Ohioans. But when somebody responds, when a professional responds to an individual in crisis and they meet them where they're at, the next thing that may occur is that somebody would need to go someplace to become stabilized. So we'll call that a stabilization center. The stabilization centers do exist in Ohio, but that is another area where Ohio continues to build out the resources available as stabilization centers. And then we cannot complete that continuum if we don't also address thriving in the local community where that person lives. So once leaving a stabilization center, having a place to return that's a safe place to go and to thrive in the community. So we really do look at this as a person-centered and quality-driven continuum. And 988 is that first piece into this continuum. So I'm going to turn it over to Tom Gerber, 988 Technical Planning Manager, and allow Tom to talk a little bit about what we're seeing in Ohio. How many people are calling and what is the response?
Thanks, Doug. Wanted to touch base a little bit on the numbers that we've been seeing. Since its inception in July, 988 calls have continued to increase across the state. Just last month, we've received over 8,600 calls into the 988 call centers. One of the things I wanted to make the distinction of is whenever somebody from Ohio calls 988, one of the very first prompts, there's two prompts that they're gonna receive. One of them is if they are a veteran, or the other one is if they are a Spanish-speaking person. If either one of those two is selected, they're immediately routed to a national call center that specifically deals with that population. The remaining calls are then routed to one of 19 call centers in the state of Ohio that are based on the caller's area code. In December, 90% of these calls were answered in state, which is that 90% has been a goal that we have established for us as a state of Ohio that we wanted to make sure that we are hitting. We hit that goal actually back in December of last year, and it stayed current with that through the months of reporting since then. And that does mark a 34% increase from the same period last year. Now, the same period last year, we were still under the NSPL kind of framework. So it's a little bit different. There's a little bit of a difference between the NSPL and 988. However, 988 is going to be the standard moving forward. Another metric that we look for is the speed of answer rate. Now we're sitting at 17.5 seconds for our speed to answer rate, which is actually considerably lower, faster than the national rate, which is averaged out at 36 seconds. Next slide, Doug. Another feature that is part of the 988 system is chat and text. So last month, we've averaged 1,452 texts that were received from Ohio area codes. I'm sorry, that's from December through from July through December. The amount of text that we received is close to 1,900, or just over 1,900. These up till December of last year, these services were received or answered at the national level. We have 3 call centers in the state of Ohio that are now receiving and answering chat and text, and that was turned on in December. We continue to increase our capacity in those 2 fields right now. Next one. The next slides that I'm going to show you go through the data that has been self-reported through our call centers. As you can see in the left graph, the Ohio originating calls answered by in-state call centers has steadily increased from July 2021 through December of 22. You're going to see a small spike that's up here. That was when 988 was actually turned on. So a lot of that spike has to do with various testing that was done throughout the state. The second, I'm sorry. Yeah, the second one also shows a steady increase from through 2022, and the rollover that was out, which means that the calls originating from 988 call centers or area codes was answered in state. So the rollovers have decreased into that national backup center, which is an indication that our capacity building continues to increase and that Ohioans are being served by Ohio call centers. The top graph here is an indicator of the contacts that were involved in emergency rescue. And we don't have all of the specifics, but we just know that these were involving where emergency services had to be dispatched at that point. So these show the calls, chats, and texts that involved an emergency response. The graph on the bottom shows that these are the calls, chats, and texts that involved a mobile crisis outreach.
Tom, just a quick question. I noticed that text, you had mentioned text has been added in 3 of the centers, and is there a desire then to add text to all of the centers, and what does that look like?
A lot of it has to do with the capability of the call centers. Naturally, we want to build that capacity out as much as possible. Our first kind of phase was looking at focusing in on the calls and making sure that the call capacity was there to answer those calls that was coming in. We're now going to start turning our attention to the chat and text, because we know that a lot of the younger population, this is how they're going to communicate and they feel more comfortable. So we're going to start trying to build out that capacity as well with the remaining call centers.
Maybe we could offer some type of a opportunity for the chat centers, centers that are using chat, to share lessons learned and possibly just provide somewhat of a training to how do you get that up and going in a call center.
Absolutely, that'd truly be helpful. The final graph here is showing the amounts of calls, chats, and texts that came in involving a suicide attempt that was in progress. This graph is showing the contacts who referred to and reported that they had services that were referred to or referred out and received by the 988 call takers.
All right, we are going to turn it now over to our 988 Quality Assurance Manager, Abby Wolschlager.
Thanks, Doug. All of our call centers, we come together twice a month to ensure that Ohio is building a unified approach to responding to calls, chats, and texts. These meetings, they've allowed the call centers to develop strong relationships, ask and identify a shared set of best practices that can be implemented across the state. And in addition to this larger meeting, and we actually just came from a meeting right prior to this, we had our 18th meeting. So we've been meeting twice a month for the last 9 months. We've also just added smaller work groups to really drill down and focused on our highest priority needs. And that includes workforce development, follow-up procedures, data and reporting, and disaster planning. Our call centers, they have a long history of serving the community, and having them at the table has really put Ohio in a great place as we build out 988. Next slide. So OMAS, we contracted with the Problem Gambling Network of Ohio to complete quality assurance calls with each of the 988 call centers within the first month of our launch. PGNO, they actually do the quality assurance calls for the gambling helpline. So they have a lot of experience with doing these quality assurance calls. So they were in like a really good position to kind of help us as we get started with our launch. And the calls were really intended to provide us with a baseline for our quality assurance work and give us a snapshot of what's going well, any training gaps and needs. And I'm happy to report that the calls went really well. The QA caller reported many positive and successful engagements with the call specialist and didn't identify any major issues. Of course, there's always areas for growth. So I'm going to talk about this in the next slide, but we've been working closely with the Ohio State University's College of Social Work to develop trainings for our call specialist. Thanks, Doug. Yeah, and so as I was saying, we've partnered with OSU to provide trainings, and these trainings are not only available for our 988 call specialists, but they are also available for free to all of the various call center staff across the state. So we've been doing this. OSU is providing trainings in 2022. So during that fiscal year, almost 6,000 people attended these trainings. In Ohio, we have about 400 call specialists across the state that are answering 988 calls. So as you can tell, there are a lot of people outside of our call centers that are taking advantage of this training, which is really great to kind of help standardize how we're responding to calls across the state. And then so far in the first 6 months of this year, we've had almost 2,000 people participate in Careline trainings. And the trainings, they are offering both live trainings, but then they're recorded and then they're available to be taken as part of they have the recorded webinars that they can take. And right now we have over 50 trainings available to really address the specific needs of Ohio. So Ohio, we have a very diverse population. And so there's trainings for specific populations, how to deal with specific issues, and really just meet the needs of our, people that are reaching out to 988 and different call centers across the state.
So a question that we often get asked, obviously 911 has been around much longer than the 3-digit number for mental health and addiction services, 988. 911 has been around over 50 years, actually, and their technology has improved over that time. They have many pieces to the technology that 988 simply does not yet have. We hope that over time we continue to develop like 911 has in their history. But one of the big differences is that 911 has the ability to geolocate a caller, to know where that caller is coming from. And in that geolocation, it also helps to route the calls to a local 911 answering center. 988 uses a different methodology. They use the area code of the telephone number of the caller who's calling. So by that area code, it routes the person to the area code's closest 988 call center. So we understand that that is a difference. That was not an Ohio decision. That is a decision that 988 call centers across the country are also working within. That decision is actually made at the FCC level, the Federal Communication Commission level. So at the FCC, there is a lot of advocacy that's happening across the state that geolocation becomes a feature of 988 as well. Now I say that, and I have to also explain that there is advocacy against geolocation for 988, because some people calling 988 do want to remain anonymous and do not want people to know where they're calling from. So it will be interesting as time goes on to see how that is resolved, whether it's resolved by having a general location of the person versus a specific location, or what the FCC will decide on. But I just wanted to explain a little bit the difference and why that difference exists, and that that is a decision made at a federal level, not at the state. But OMAS, our 988 team with you today, we have worked with the 911 state administrator and the 911 public service answering points, called PSAPs, across the state of Ohio to have regional meetings where 988 call centers and 911 answering centers came together and started to talk about what that interoperability looks like. And some of the things that we found here in the conversations was much in line with the way that Ohio approaches much of our state programming, and that is through local rule. So in Ohio, local communities have much authority to decide how the resources of the local authority will work together. So we were in some areas where a 911 public service answering point would say, you know, we're not real interested right now in transferring calls to 988. And some of the barriers that they discussed were specifically liability. So if a call comes into 911 and they were to transfer that call to 988, what liability does the 911 center have in transferring the call, and once the call is transferred, no longer being able to assist in resolving that call? So liability was a significant discussion that was there. And then just the desire to do so, and what would happen once that interoperability is in place. So what is the response that happens? Is there mobile crisis response? What are the procedures and the protocols to make those things happen? So we are not to a place of full interoperability between 911 and 988. However, there is much interest from law enforcement and other emergency responders to have this interoperability. Tom, I'm going to throw it over to you for just a second. You have a background as a state trooper. What does that look like to have a resource with 988 being available to a law enforcement officer?
Thanks, Doug. Yeah, for those that aren't familiar with my background, I'm a retired sergeant from the Highway Patrol. I'm still currently a sworn officer with the Shawnee Hills Police Department. As a first responder and a law enforcement officer, there have been numerous incidences in my career where I've had to respond to somebody that is in crisis. Now, for being in crisis is a brand new term for me that I never knew what that meant before. Law enforcement officers, first responders tend to look at the Ohio Revised Code and how does this action fit into this law? Is there something that has been broken? And if not, sometimes you're left standing there like, okay, what do I do? There's a lack of resources that are out there for the community, or at least a knowledge of what's out there, at least in the first responder community, and for law enforcement officers in general. We're used to responding to somebody that's breaking the law, take action, write a report, file charges, take them to jail, and that's usually about it. So having 988 as another tool in the tool belt to help the community is a huge thing for us. I can think back of one of my last, before I retired, one of the last incidences, we get a call of somebody that is threatening suicide that's traveling on a state route. So me and another officer head up that way, find him that's parked in a township parking lot, or township office parking lot, made contact with them. He's having problems. The sheriff's department shows up. We're sitting there scratching our heads. We call a squad. All right, well, who's going to pink slip this person? Is the ER going to take them? At that point, we knew nothing better. Having 988 in that instance for either us to call or referring that to that subject that was having issues that needed somebody to talk to would have been a far better response and being able to give them the help that they needed at that moment.
Thanks, Tom. I think that just is, it's good to have Tom as part of the team for the perspective that he brings, but also as we work on interoperability, Tom is able to help us connect with those who are answering the phones for 911 as well as first responders themselves. So one of the other pieces that the state agency is working on is a resource directory. So what is a resource directory? How does that fit into 988? Imagine if you were a 988 call taker, we call them a call specialist, and a call comes in and the person needs a referral, needs some place to go maybe the next day or maybe even that day to be connected to a resource. Well, we want to make that as easy as possible for the 988 call specialist. While they're on the phone, we don't want them to have to search for resources that are available or wonder what the hours of operation are, or if they have the ability to be transported there. So we are working to create a statewide resource directory. What that also allows is the resource directory can be used by any call center throughout the state of Ohio. So if a call was to roll over from the primary call center in the local area of the caller to a secondary or backup call center, that backup call center would have the same list of available resources to refer the person to. The resource directory would also be public facing. So if somebody was just searching for themselves, they could use this resource directory and find the same resources that a 988 call specialist would be offering to the person as a resource. So this is a significant project that we are working on. In 2023 will be the launch of this, making it available, as I said, to all call centers, 988 call centers, and to the public. So I want to circle back around to the crisis continuum, because I think that this is an important graphic. This graphic actually comes from a provider agency in Arizona called Connections. Arizona has been doing crisis response for some time by using call centers and mobile crisis responders. And so they have been collecting data far longer than Ohio. We are collecting data, though, even initially, that is trending along the same pattern. So happy to report that this is not unique to one state. This is very applicable to people in crisis and to their responses that they are receiving. So first of all, if the person in crisis calls that crisis line, about 80% of the phone calls that are made to 988 can be resolved by the call specialist on the phone. What that tells us is the person calling oftentimes just needs somebody to listen or to talk to, maybe offer some resources that are local that the person could tap into. But the phone call is resolved on the call itself, not needing any further action to be taken. But if you go on down through the crisis continuum, mobile crisis teams may be needed to go out and respond in person. So about 20% of the calls are needing some sort of a mobile crisis response. And when a mobile crisis team shows up, about 71% of those are resolved in the field. So by having somebody in person to talk to, the person now can stay where they are at, no need to go further. However, sometimes a mobile crisis team might have to take the person that is in crisis someplace to help that individual. If they can take them to a crisis facility, then the person typically can be served in the crisis facility, about 68% discharged back to the community. Now, there are still cases where the crisis facility might need additional resources and a person might have to be referred out for medical need to a hospital. But the goal is to get the person the resource that they need and then back into the community, with the ultimate goal being that there is a decrease in the use of jails and emergency departments, a decrease in the use of first responders, emergency responders needing to show up, so law enforcement or ambulance. And because those calls are being answered and resolved by either the phone call itself, mobile crisis, or crisis stabilization centers, we know that we are succeeding in the intent of 988. Abby, do you have anything else that you want to add from a clinical perspective to the crisis continuum and what we're seeing here?
I would just like to add, I'm very excited about the dollars that we have going towards the crisis continuum. I think it's going to be wonderful to see mobile crisis get built out more across the state. There was a question about what counties and parts of Ohio have these resources. And I know something that Governor DeWine has mentioned recently is that across the state, our crisis continuum just hasn't fully been built out. So it's going to be great to see these start to pop up across the state, because there are many areas where we do have a lot of gaps. So the more we have mobile response, the more we're going to be able to have that response versus law enforcement who can respond more appropriately to, safety issues in the community.
Abby, could you talk a little bit about the difference between, for instance, 911 and 988 in terms of when you have a caller on the phone at 988, it's not about getting that call resolved quickly as much as it is some kind of a quality thing that you're trying to do. And sometimes that means keeping them on the phone longer, and how you're dealing with those kinds of measures. And what a call might look like that's different from 911, I guess, is my other question around that.
Yeah, absolutely. So the 988 is, people can call for such a wide variety of reasons. Everybody defines crisis a little bit different, and we intentionally leave that definition open because we want people to call, to reach out. So the big difference, and we have a really great info slide that we usually have, but we didn't include in this particular presentation, that kind of talks about the difference between, what a crisis is and what is an emergency, which would require that we call 911. So a crisis is really, a lot of stressors that people experience that lead to mental health symptoms. So someone could be like very stressed out, they lost their job, they're having relationship issues, they're experiencing symptoms of depression, they're concerned about a loved one, something a little more severe where they're having suicidal thoughts. Those are all great calls to 988. And the call specialist goal is really to engage that person, identify coping skills, and get them connected with resources, and kind of resolve the immediate crisis on the phone, and hopefully connect them to support in the community. And sometimes that could be something outpatient, or, just a lot of times stressors are related to, daily things that happen. So kind of just talking through it can resolve it. Sometimes it can be something like outpatient services, and sometimes it can kind of go up the scale to mobile response. And then sometimes, as this infograph talks about, is that a small percentage of the time we might have to involve law enforcement. And then 911, if somebody is actively suicidal, like they have a plan, they have means, they have intent, we want that to be a 911 call. So if a call specialist identify that, that's imminent risk, and we want to connect them with 911. Sometimes, if somebody has those thoughts, but they're able to safety plan, we can maybe step that down a little bit. So that could be a goal of being over the phone. But the big difference is thoughts versus like an actual plan, or, if somebody's experienced substance use issues, that would be a call to 988. But if they have overdosed or if they've taken something, we would want them to call 911 in that situation.
Abby, sometimes we get calls at our office here in Akron about a person that's in Columbus, let's say, that really is struggling and possibly even talking about suicide. Should we direct our friends in Columbus, that family, to call 988 to get connected with help that will meet their needs? Will 988 be able to get them, even if it's not like an emergency, but it's just like possibly going to be a bad thing happening down the road ahead of time?
Yeah, absolutely. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, if somebody is, having thoughts or they're really struggling, 988 is really a great place to start. And even sometimes people hear the word crisis and they think that it has to be something really serious for them to call, but we just want them to call. So if anybody's having any thoughts or they don't know what to do or they don't know where to start, 988 is a really easy number to remember, that people can call, and we can get you started with, figuring out what's going on, get you connected with resources, kind of talk you through next steps.
And Tom, something else that fits into that scenario would be that what you described, if a person knows someone who might be having those thoughts or might be in crisis, whether it's a family member, a loved one, a neighbor, many calls that come into 988 are not for the person, him or herself, it's for a loved one or somebody that they know. So what resources are available to help that individual that they love? And those are welcome conversations as well. It is an answering point to provide those resources. Also in Ohio, there are many local crisis lines, and 988 was never intended to replace those numbers. If those numbers are available locally and the caller knows that number, maybe they have a history with that number, and that number still exists, then by all means, we would encourage the person to call a local number that they would have. But we did want the purpose of 988 to be known as an easy number to remember, a national number. So no matter where you go in the country, even if you're on vacation, sometimes vacations de-stress you and sometimes vacations stress you. And so even if you were on vacation, you could still dial 988 and get a response.
Tom, there's a couple of questions in the chat. I don't know if you can see those.
So I think we actually addressed the second to last question, but the most recent one is when you say we want to connect them with 911 when there is high risk. What exactly does that look like? Is it a three-way call or is it a please hold while I transfer your call?
Ideally, that would be a warm handoff to a 911 operator, if they've already called 988. And that also brings back how 988 calls come through with that lack of geolocation. If you call 911, regardless of your phone settings, a lot of those phone settings are overridden as soon as you dial 911, and that geolocation of that phone gets transferred whether you want it to or not. With 988, that doesn't happen. So if somebody's in active crisis or is actively trying to commit suicide, and there's a warm handoff, that since it originated on the 988 side, that geolocation doesn't automatically pick up as soon as it gets to 911 call center. So that's some of the problems that are inherent in that system that are going to have to be looked at, debated, and decided upon. Because at the end of the day, we're trying to get help to that person that's in need. Sometimes without that geolocation, that's next to impossible.
One of the things that we've put in place too, and many 988 centers have been successful working with their local 911 center, is utilizing what we call the terminal numbers, which is like a backdoor number into that call center. And that allows the 988 call center to connect into the local 911 call center through that administrative line to help with that warm transfer. And that's reciprocated in that the 911 centers have the terminal numbers to a 988 center so that they can get it to the most local 988 center possible. So we have put some of those measures in place to help us bridge the gap until we get to better technology integration. Great. Tom or Abby, is there any more questions that you see in the chat that would be appropriate here?
Nope, I think that we've answered everything so far.
Okay. We'll move on. Highlight a couple other things. Hold on one second. Oops. So when 988 went live or launched in July of 2022, there had not been a marketing campaign within the state. And you might think to yourself, well, how in the heck does everybody know about it? And why do I see it all over the place? If you've been on social media or seen television commercials or news stories, or we even have reports of people that have attended concerts, and at the concert, there'll be a public service announcement about 988. That has happened, I'll use the word organically, to date. There's been a lot of talk about 988, some intentional from local resources, our local Adamus boards here in Ohio putting out information about 988, and all of that is greatly appreciated. Any spotlight on 988 is helpful as far as educating people that the number exists and what the number is intended to serve. We do have plans to do more marketing, but we intentionally held off because what we knew was we had to test and make sure that the 988 system had the capacity it needed to answer the calls that were coming in. So we were very happy to, on July 16th, as calls started rolling in, have those calls being answered. As I said, we were testing it prior to that, but specifically as that call volume spiked on July 16th, many test calls coming in, many actual calls coming in, all of those calls were being answered. But as we look to the future, a strategic goal that we have is to have a marketing campaign to help educate people that 988 exists and why it exists. So we will be working with that as a marketing campaign to make it available throughout the state. And from our state agency, making it available to our local partners and stakeholders so that it can be branded with, we'll say, a county board's, an Adamus board's logo or a provider's logo added to it as well. Because we want people to understand that this is a local response when somebody calls. We currently have marketing material available, and you can contact our office and we can get out some materials. We've received that from our federal partners at SAMHSA, and when that runs out, that runs out. But again, a marketing campaign forthcoming. There is also a marketing, what we call a partner toolkit that our federal partners have produced. So SAMHSA, it is on the SAMHSA 988 webpage, and it has logos and fonts and colors and things so that 988 marketing is consistent no matter who is putting that collateral material together. So happy that people want to market 988, intentional on how we are slowly getting to the place of having a broader educational campaign.
Doug, you had mentioned earlier in the conversation about your working closely with a 911 administrator and meeting with 911 dispatch folks together with the 988 people. And that was a deliberate process, wasn't it? And what other deliberate processes are you planning? And it's a little more deeper than marketing. It's that idea that you're getting out and really making sure that everyone's on the same page about the capacity of 988 and the plans for 988.
Yeah, we want to be intentional to get the word out to in every way that we can to every audience, but do so in a way that is relevant to that audience, to that person. So we want to look to what are underserved populations and how can they receive 988 marketing material that's relevant to them? Maybe that's in a foreign language. We have many foreign languages spoken and written in here in Ohio. So whether it's chat, text, or a call, we want to make sure that people understand that they would be responded to in their own native language. We also have other groups that are marginalized groups. We want to market specifically 988 in a way that they understand 988 is for them as well. So we will not only just be putting together a generic marketing campaign, but one that specifically reaches those groups. Youth is another population. We could put television commercials on all day long and the youth would probably never see it because the media that they're watching is a streaming service. So we want to make sure we're intentional in that as well. Tom, does that answer your question?
Yes, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. So we're going to talk about a couple things that have happened since July in the 988 space here in Ohio and nationally, and just address some of those. So on December 1st, 2022, 988 actually experienced an outage of services for telephone calls. Our chat and text continued without disruption, but the primary use of 988 still continues to be telephone calls. And there was a national outage that wasn't unique to Ohio, it was all the way across the country. I remember waking up on that morning and logging into my work computer, and not long after I had logged in, this message came across that there was a 988 outage. And kind of the worst case nightmare for a 988 administrator here in the state of Ohio. You can imagine the thoughts that were going through my mind as this went down, like this has got to just be a bad dream. It did occur. Indeed, 988 went down, and it was down for several hours. Interestingly, it took months because we just recently, within the last week or so, got the reports that was caused by a cyber attack on the call routing vendor. So there's a lot of technology that goes on behind the scenes on making sure calls get to where they need to go. And that call routing vendor apparently had a cyber attack that affected their ability to route calls. So what we realized right away is we need to have disaster plans or outage plans in place. And so Tom Gerber, do you want to talk just a minute about some of the things that we're considering as we look to what those outage and disaster plans are?
Sure, Doug. Yeah, one of the big things that we have to look for is in looking at these is worst case scenario planning. Now, naturally, this was definitely a worst case scenario where the actual service level or telecommunications provider had a cyber attack lodged against them. Some of these events will be out of our control. Other ones are definitely within our control to affect. Some of the things that we're recommending to our centers include redundancy in their network, so that they don't just have one internet service provider coming into their center to provide services. When you've got redundancy built into the systems, just like any other system that you're looking at, whether it be IT or aircraft or anything else like that, when engineers put things together, they're looking for redundancy in systems, in critical systems, so that any attack on one thing doesn't affect the overall. We're also recommending to our centers and working with them as far as disaster planning, of looking at redundancy of power supplies, making sure that there's backups into the call centers. Now, one of the things too that with our 19 call centers, they all handle things a little bit differently, and that's the way that is. That some of them have implemented and have a majority of their call takers that are on work from home, work remote. That's got advantages, disadvantages, but one of the main advantages is that also gives you a little bit of redundancy built into the system, because they're not all in one place. They could be spread out over multiple counties. They could have different internet service providers coming into their home, multiple different power suppliers, people that are providing their power. So that gives us a little bit of redundancy built into that system as well. So at this point, we're really working with our senators and going to be starting some work groups that are going to look at emergency planning, redundancy, and trying to plan for these contingencies in the best way that we know how.
Thanks, Tom. It's definitely important that 988 is available when people need it. So we've talked a lot about 911 and 988 and interoperability, but we also wanted to just address some stories that are out there. And that story is that if you call 988, police will show up. And we already reported that about 80% of the calls are being managed by the call itself. One of the other statistics that was found in that same Arizona study is that for their state, again, long history of answering mobile crisis or 988 type calls and sending out mobile crisis response, about 2% of the calls coming in needed a police response. And out of that 2%, half of those, or 1%, were a voluntary request for law enforcement response. So only 1% of the calls coming in having an involuntary response or involuntary to the person, but a needed response from police. So those would be if there is an imminent risk to the person's own health or to somebody else's health and safety. So we would call it a myth that police are going to come every time 988 is called. And people have taken it that far as to say, well, every time I call 988, the police are going to show up. It is true that if there is a need, and that need being a very limited case scenario, that the police may be needed to respond, but most of the time, the person gets exactly the support they need by calling 988 without any type of a law enforcement response. One of the other things that our state agency is working on, and this is probably thought of once you get up and going. We were thinking of it ahead of time, but it became more realistic as calls started to roll in. And that's what happens when an Ohio caller is out of state and they call, and because of the area code, that call is routed to our Ohio call center. Maybe they've moved, taken their phone with them, maybe they're on vacation, but they're out of state, they call, they get an Ohio call center. Or vice versa, somebody else from out of state is in Ohio and they're calling and they're getting an out of state response, even though they're in Ohio. So because of that lack of geolocation, we're seeing the need for this more and more. But we look at it as, especially on the border states, because we have many people who live near a border and maybe work outside of Ohio or live out of state and work in Ohio. How do we work with the surrounding or border states? So we have successfully made contact with Michigan, Indiana, Kentucky, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, and Michigan to begin those conversations, and even involving those 988 centers from across the border in meetings that we've had with 988 centers in Ohio. So we've begun to set those meetings up and have successfully accomplished some of those meetings to have the conversations about calls that happen across state lines. Also, we have many call centers in Ohio. I've referenced those earlier as local crisis and warm lines across the state. And we are we're in the early stages of engaging those call centers in the 988 community of practice. So we are identifying those centers, coming up with the contact or the staff person at those centers that we can work with to engage them in our community of practice, so that as local responses are needed through the local crisis line, we have those points of contact and interoperability with those call lines as well. Finally, I'll talk about funding for 988. So 988 was a federal mandate that came unfunded. So an unfunded mandate. Those are always fun to receive as a state, but Ohio has been very strong in responding to what that meant. We saw the need for it, not only because it was a mandate, but because it is a way for us to respond to the crisis needs of individuals over the phone. And Governor DeWine has been very supportive of behavioral health services in Ohio, specifically highlighted by the biennial budget, which he just 2 weeks ago presented. And that biennial budget had $46.5 million in general revenue funds that would be dedicated to 988 services in Ohio over the next 2 years, viewing that as a permanent funding source for 988 and crisis response. So we are happy to have the governor's support. We'll continue to work with the General Assembly on what the funding level is and how those funds are intended to be used in Ohio, the best way to collect or generate those funds, all of those conversations. But just wanting to highlight that here in Ohio, we do have tremendous support from our governor, and that we have used federal funds as well to get the program off the ground, to increase workforce capacity, to increase technology by investing in some of the technology that would benefit the call centers and being able to respond to 988 calls. And then Abby, do you want to talk just a minute about some of the consistencies and protocol and procedures that we're working on?
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned earlier, we are really, in order to have our protocols be standardized across the state, really using that community of practice, the meetings with all of the call centers coming together to identify a shared set of consistent best practices, just so that, you know, no matter where you are in Ohio, when you call 988, you're receiving the same response. We have been very lucky to partner with PIRE, the Pacific Institute of Research and Evaluation, to help us with collecting and analyzing the data from the different call centers so that we can really work on improving those metrics and making sure that when Ohioans call 988 for support, our call centers are responding to those calls. Ohio has a statewide answer rate of 90%, and we have, I think it's been 3 or 4 months that we have achieved that or exceeded that. So we're very proud of all of our call centers. Sorry, Tom.
We're down to our last 3 minutes, so I want to make sure that we have a chance to thank you all and close the meeting with. I want to introduce you to Allie for a minute, because we will have an opportunity for you to send more of your questions our way. We can make sure that they get to the proper folks like Doug and Abby and Tom. And we also want to make sure that to remind you that that these kinds of learning sessions occur because we get your interest in what you would like to hear and what you would like to learn about. And I think we got some more ideas today about other things that we would like to learn. So if everybody could turn on their screen for a second and just wave and thank Doug and Abby and Tom, just in thanks. That's the best way we can clap, I guess. And then I'll turn it over to Allie for a second to just mention our follow-up.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. So you'll see I just pasted in chat. There's a brief survey. It's just 3 questions. It should take a minute or under, but we are looking to get ideas for future lunch and learns. So if you could take a minute just to complete that, we will look at those responses and then plan for future topics based on what we hear. Our next lunch and learn is scheduled for April 20th, and that will be on measurement for crisis services. So we will send out more information about that, as well as a recording from today and slides from today. Thank you again to Doug, Abby, and Tom, and we look forward to seeing you all at a future lunch and learn.